The opening weeks of 2026 are quietly rewriting the rules of global power, not through declarations or treaties, but through action. What we are witnessing is not a single crisis, nor an isolated decision, but a pattern emerging across continents. Military posturing is accelerating, political restraint is eroding, and the language of international norms is being replaced by the logic of leverage and force. The United States sits at the center of this shift, not as a passive reactor, but as an active driver of a new strategic tempo that is forcing allies and adversaries alike to reassess their assumptions. The most revealing aspect of this moment is not the scale of American power, which has long been understood, but the way it is now being exercised. Statements from Washington suggest a growing indifference toward traditional legal frameworks that once governed intervention, sovereignty, and escalation control. When a global power signals that international law is optional rather than binding, it sends a shockwave far beyond the immediate target of its actions. It changes calculations in capitals from Beijing to Moscow, from Tehran to Brussels. The question is no longer what is allowed, but what can be done without triggering unacceptable costs. This shift has been reinforced by recent military and political decisions that point toward a more transactional worldview. In this framework, restraint is not a virtue unless it serves immediate strategic interests. Deterrence is no longer purely defensive, it is demonstrative. The purpose is not only to prevent adversaries from acting, but to condition them psychologically, to normalize the idea that escalation thresholds have moved. This is why early 2026 feels different. The signals are sharper, the margins thinner, and the tolerance for ambiguity significantly lower. What complicates this transformation is the growing tension between American executive power and internal political resistance. While the presidency projects confidence and decisiveness abroad, domestic institutions are showing signs of unease. Legislative efforts to constrain military authority suggest that even within the United States, there is concern that the pace of action is outrunning consensus. This internal friction matters because it introduces uncertainty. Allies are unsure which signals represent long-term strategy and which are temporary impulses. Adversaries, meanwhile, may misread political division as weakness or overestimate the permanence of aggressive postures. Europe is already feeling the strain. Tensions within NATO, once unthinkable at the level of direct confrontation, are now openly discussed. When allied states begin issuing warnings rather than reassurances, it reveals a deeper anxiety about predictability. NATO was built on shared assumptions about restraint, consultation, and mutual respect for sovereignty. As those assumptions weaken, so does the coherence of the alliance. This does not mean collapse, but it does mean friction, and friction in military alliances increases the risk of miscalculation. Beyond Europe, the implications are even more severe. Russia and China are not simply observing these developments, they are integrating them into their own strategic planning. A world in which the United States openly deprioritizes legal constraints is a world where countermeasures become more justifiable, at least in their own narratives. Military exercises grow larger, response times shorten, and doctrines harden. Each side prepares not for cooperation, but for reaction. The result is a security environment where escalation becomes easier not because leaders desire it, but because systems are designed to respond faster than diplomacy can operate. The Middle East remains a critical pressure point in this evolving order. Any perception that intervention thresholds have lowered will be tested in regions where deterrence is already fragile. Iran, in particular, represents a boundary case. Unlike weaker or isolated states, it possesses layered deterrence and regional reach. The Venezuelan precedent, while dramatic, cannot be mechanically applied to such actors. Attempting to do so would risk cascading escalation far beyond the original objective. Yet the mere discussion of such possibilities alters regional behavior, encouraging hedging, proxy strengthening, and preemptive positioning. What makes this moment especially dangerous is the erosion of shared expectations. International stability has never depended on goodwill alone, but on predictable behavior. When predictability declines, actors rely more heavily on worst-case assumptions. Military planners begin to prepare for scenarios that were once dismissed as improbable. Diplomatic signals lose credibility. Crisis management mechanisms are tested under stress they were never designed to handle. This is how accidents happen, not through intent, but through compression of time and trust. At the heart of this transformation is a recalibration of cost. For decades, violating sovereignty carried political and strategic penalties that discouraged all but the most extreme actions. Today, those penalties appear diminished or at least negotiable. When the cost of action falls below the perceived cost of inaction, intervention becomes not just possible, but tempting. This does not signal a return to constant regime change, but it does suggest a future where power is exercised more openly, and restraint must be actively justified rather than assumed. The broader consequence is a world drifting away from rule-based management toward power-based bargaining. Smaller states will feel this shift most acutely. Without strong deterrence or reliable alliances, they become testing grounds for new doctrines and capabilities. Larger powers, meanwhile, will seek to insulate themselves through alliances, arms build-up, and strategic ambiguity. The gap between security providers and security consumers will widen, increasing inequality in global stability. As 2026 unfolds, the defining question is not whether this trend will continue, but how others will respond. Will rivals push back symmetrically or seek asymmetric counters? Will allies adapt, resist, or quietly hedge? Will domestic constraints reassert themselves or be overridden by momentum? The answers will determine whether this period becomes a brief spike in tension or the foundation of a more confrontational era. History suggests that moments like this rarely announce themselves clearly. They are recognized only in retrospect, when patterns solidify into structures. What is unfolding now carries the hallmarks of such a transition. A system built on restraint is giving way to one built on calculation. Stability is no longer guaranteed by norms, but by fear of consequence. And when fear replaces rules, the margin for error narrows to a dangerous degree.